The casket was closed because my daughter-in-law insisted the accident was too severe for an open viewing. Standing there in my black dress, watching mourners file past what was supposedly my son's body, I received a text that made my knees buckle. Mom, I'm alive. That's not me in the coffin. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Let me back up and tell you how this nightmare began. Just like many of you, I thought I knew my family. I was Evelyn Carter, 68 years old, recently retired from teaching high school English for 41 years. I'd raised my son Michael as a single mother after his father walked out when Michael was 6. We were close, or so I believed. Michael had married Jessica 4 years ago, a woman I'd tried my best to love, despite the red flags. She was controlling, manipulative, and had an unsettling way of inserting herself between Michael and everyone who cared about him. But I bit my tongue because I wanted my son to be happy. 3 weeks before the funeral, Michael had called me excited about a new business venture. Mom, Jessica, and I are going into real estate development. We found this incredible opportunity in Georgia. I can't tell you much yet, but we might need to relocate temporarily. His voice had an edge of excitement I hadn't heard in years. Just be careful, sweetheart. I'd said that motherly instinct prickling. These investment schemes can be risky. It's not a scheme, Mom. This is legitimate, big money, life-changing money. He'd laughed, but there was something forced about it. Jessica's really good with numbers. She's figured it all out. The next week, I got the call that every parent dreads. Jessica, sobbing hysterically, told me Michael had been killed in a car accident. The vehicle had caught fire, she claimed, leaving his body badly burned and difficult to identify. She insisted on handling all the funeral arrangements herself. I can't bear for you to see him like that, she'd wailed into the phone. Please, Evelyn, let me protect you from this horror. Something about her performance felt rehearsed. But grief makes you question your own instincts. I'd buried my husband 21 years earlier. I knew how shock could make people behave strangely. So, I'd agreed to the closed casket against every fiber of my being. But now, standing at my son's funeral with his impossible text message glowing on my phone screen, I realized my instincts had been screaming warnings I'd chosen to ignore. The woman weeping dramatically beside me wasn't a grieving widow. She was an actress putting on the performance of her life, and apparently, my son was very much alive. I slipped out of the funeral parlor, my hands shaking as I typed back, "Where are you? What's happening?" The response came immediately. "Can't explain now. They're watching. Meet me at the old Harrison farm tomorrow, 3:30 p.m. Come alone. Don't trust Jessica." My mind reeled as I walked back into the viewing room, forcing myself to accept condolences from neighbors and friends who had no idea they were mourning an empty box. Jessica clung to my arm, her perfectly applied makeup somehow never smudging despite her constant tears. "Thank you for being so strong, Evelyn," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "Michael would be so proud of how you're handling this." I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and demand the truth, but something told me to play along. If Michael was hiding, there had to be a reason. And if these people were dangerous enough to fake his death, confronting Jessica publicly could put us both at risk. Instead, I smiled sadly and patted her hand. "We'll get through this together, dear." The Harrison farm was where Michael used to take his dates as a teenager, thinking I didn't know. It had been abandoned for years, sitting on 25 acres of overgrown land about 18 minutes outside town. If someone wanted to meet secretly, it was the perfect spot. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. What had Michael gotten himself into? Was he really in danger? Or was this some elaborate scheme he and Jessica were running together? The rational part of my mind said the text could be fake. That grief was making me grasp at impossible hopes. But the message had come from Michael's phone, and who else would know about the Harrison farm? The next afternoon, I drove my old Toyota Corolla down the dirt road, leading to the abandoned farmhouse, my heart hammering against my ribs. If Michael was alive, why fake his death? If he was in trouble, why not come to me for help? As I pulled up to the crumbling house, I saw a figure emerge from behind the old barn. Even from a distance, I recognized the walk, the way he held his shoulders. It was my son, very much alive, and looking nervously over his shoulder. Michael ran to my car as I parked, and when I stepped out, he pulled me into a fierce hug that confirmed what my heart already knew. This was real. My boy was breathing warm, alive. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he whispered into my hair. "I never wanted you to go through that funeral, but I had to make sure you were safe first. Safe from what I pulled back to look at his face, searching for answers." His eyes were haunted, older than they'd been just weeks ago from the people Jessica had been working with. "Mom, I think they want to kill me for real." We sat in his truck behind the old barn while Michael explained how his perfect marriage had become a nightmare. Jessica hadn't just married him for love. She'd married him for access to something much more valuable than his teacher's pension. "Remember when Grandpa Joe died and left you that property in Montana?" Michael asked. I nodded. My father had owned 50 acres of what everyone thought was worthless mountain land. I'd never even seen it, just paid the property taxes every year out of habit. Jessica had it surveyed without telling either of us. Turns out, there's a natural gas reserve underneath it worth millions, maybe tens of millions. Michael's jaw tightened. She's been planning to get her hands on it this whole time. "But the land is in my name," I said, confused. "Was in your name. Remember those papers you signed last month, the ones Jessica said were for Michael's life insurance beneficiary updates?" My blood went cold. I'd trusted my daughter-in-law when she'd brought me a stack of legal documents explaining that Michael wanted to make sure everything was in order for our family's financial security. I'd signed without reading carefully because I trusted her. She forged some of the paperwork, Michael continued. "Made it look like you were transferring the property to me as part of estate planning. Then she had me sign papers that would make her the sole heir if anything happened to me." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. "So if you're dead, she owns land worth millions." Exactly, but here's where it gets worse. The people she's working with aren't just paper pushers. They're criminals, Mom. They've done this before to other families, targeting older people with valuable assets they don't know they have. I felt that familiar surge of protective anger I'd experienced throughout Michael's childhood. Nobody threatened my boy and got away with it. "How did you find out I overheard a phone call?" Jessica was talking to someone about how they'd handle my accident. She was planning the funeral arrangements before I was supposed to be dead. He shuddered. I realized I had maybe hours before they made their move. "So you disappeared?" I had to. But I also had to make sure they thought their plan worked at least temporarily. If they knew I was alive, they might come after you to force me out of hiding. I studied my son's face, seeing the man he'd become under pressure. "Whose body is in that casket, Michael? Nobody's. It's weighted with sandbags." I figured if I could buy enough time, maybe I could find evidence to stop them. He looked at me with desperate hope. "Mom, I need your help. These people are serious, and I can't fight them alone." For 41 years, I'd protected this boy from scraped knees, broken hearts, and teenage mistakes. Now he needed me to help him survive something far more dangerous. The teacher in me wanted to march him straight to the police, but the mother in me recognized the fear in his eyes was real. "What do you need me to do?" Michael's relief was palpable. "First, we need to get you somewhere safe. Then we need to figure out how to expose what Jessica's really doing before she realizes I'm not actually dead." As if summoned by his words, my phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Evelyn, can you come over tonight? There are some of Michael's business papers I need to go over with you." The trap was already closing, but now we knew it was coming. I agreed to meet Jessica that evening, playing the role of grieving mother-in-law, while my very much alive son hid in the abandoned farmhouse. The plan was simple: get evidence of her scheme while she still believed I was an easy target. Jessica and Michael lived in a modest 2-story house that I'd helped them buy with a down payment gift 2 years ago. Another investment in my son's happiness that had apparently been part of a longer con. "Thank you for coming," Jessica said, greeting me at the door with red-rimmed eyes and a trembling voice. "Oscar-worthy performance, truly." She led me to the kitchen table where she'd spread out various documents. "I know this is difficult, but we need to start thinking about Michael's estate. There are some assets that need to be transferred, and I wanted to make sure you understood everything." I put on my reading glasses and examined the papers, recognizing some from the stack I'd signed the month before. Others were new, including what appeared to be a power of attorney form giving Jessica control over my Montana property. "I don't understand," I said, channeling my inner confused elderly woman. "Why would Michael's estate need anything to do with my land?" Jessica's mask slipped for just a moment, a flash of irritation crossing her features before the grieving widow returned. "Michael was handling your estate planning, remember? He wanted to make sure everything would be simple for you as you get older." The condescension in her voice made my teeth clench, but I forced myself to appear grateful. "That's so thoughtful. But I'm not that old, dear. I can still manage my own affairs." "Of course you can," she said quickly. "But Michael worried about you living alone, especially after that fall you had last winter." I'd slipped on ice and bruised my hip, hardly a sign of declining mental capacity, but I could see how they'd been building a narrative about my supposed fragility probably for months. Well, if Michael thought it was best. I reached for a pen, then paused as if confused. "But why does this paper say the property is worth $15 million? My father's old land isn't worth anything." Jessica's pupils dilated slightly. "That's just a placeholder number for insurance purposes. Legal documents require estimated values." I nodded, as if that made perfect sense, then deliberately knocked over my water glass, soaking the papers. "Oh no, I'm so clumsy." While Jessica rushed to get towels, I quickly took photos of the soggy documents with my phone. When she returned, I was dabbing helplessly at the mess. "I'm so sorry, dear. Should we do this another day?" No, it's fine," Jessica said. But I could see the frustration she was trying to hide. "I have copies. Why don't we just focus on the property transfer tonight? We can handle the rest later." She produced a fresh copy of the power of attorney document, and I pretended to read it carefully while actually studying her face. There was something predatory in her expression when she thought I wasn't looking, like a cat watching a mouse. "Will this help with taxes?" I asked innocently. "Absolutely. It'll save you thousands." She leaned forward eagerly. "All you need to do is sign right here." I picked up the pen, then set it down again. "You know, I think I should have my lawyer look at this first. Michael always said never to sign legal documents without professional advice." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10. Jessica's smile became strained, almost grotesque. "Evelyn, I am family. You can trust me. And the longer we wait, the more complicated the tax situation becomes." Something in her tone made my survival instincts kick into high gear. This wasn't just about money anymore. I was looking at a woman who would do whatever it took to get what she wanted, including eliminating obstacles. "I'm sure you understand, dear. It's just good practice." I stood up, gathering my purse. "I'll call my attorney tomorrow." Jessica's composure finally cracked. "Sit down, Evelyn. We're not finished here." The grieving widow was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous. And I realized my son hadn't been paranoid at all. The drive back to my house felt like the longest 22 minutes of my life. Every car that followed too closely, every shadow that seemed out of place, made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was convinced Jessica had already figured out that I knew too much. I was right. 3 men were waiting in my living room when I walked through the front door. They weren't trying to hide their presence. They'd turned on my lamps and made themselves comfortable on my furniture like they owned the place. Mrs. Carter said the one sitting in my late husband's recliner, a man in his 50s with the kind of face you'd forget immediately if you weren't terrified of it. "We need to talk." My teacher instincts kicked in. The same calm authority I'd used to control unruly teenagers for 4 decades. "I don't recall inviting anyone into my home. You'll need to leave immediately." The man smiled. And it was worse than if he'd threatened me outright. "I'm afraid we can't do that just yet." "See, there's been some confusion about your son's business affairs, and we need to clear it up." "My son is dead," I said flatly. "Whatever business he had died with him." "That's the thing, Mrs. Carter. We have reason to believe Michael might not be as dead as everyone thinks." My heart stopped, but I kept my expression neutral. "That's a terrible thing to say. I buried my boy today. Did you?" The second man, younger with cold eyes, pulled out his phone and showed me a grainy photo of Michael taken that afternoon near the Harrison farm. Because this was taken about 3 hours ago. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. How had they found him so quickly? "I don't know what kind of sick game you're playing, but no games, Mrs. Carter. Your son owes us money. A lot of money. And since he's decided to play dead instead of paying up, we're going to have to collect from his next of kin." The third man, who'd been silent until now, spoke up one way or another. "We're getting what we're owed. Either Michael surfaces and pays his debts, or you transfer that Montana property to cover what he owes." They knew about the land, which meant Jessica had already told them everything probably before Michael's supposed death. This whole elaborate scheme was falling apart, and they were moving to Plan B. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked, playing for time while trying to figure out how to warn Michael. $3 million plus interest. Your boy made some very poor investment choices with our money." The number hit me like a punch to the stomach. Even if the land was worth what they claimed, there was no way I could liquidate it quickly enough to save Michael's life. "I don't have that kind of money," I said honestly. "But you have land worth 10 times that amount. Sign it over to us and your son's debt is forgiven. He can even come home and pretend to rise from the dead. Very biblical." The man in my husband's chair leaned forward. "Or you can keep protecting him, and we'll find him eventually anyway. But then we'll collect the money and make sure he never bothers us again, along with anyone who helped him hide." The threat was crystal clear. "They'd kill us both if I didn't cooperate. I need time to think about this," I said. "You have until tomorrow night. Jessica will bring you the papers." He stood up, straightening his jacket. "Make the right choice, Mrs. Carter, for both your sakes." They left as casually as they'd arrived, and I stood in my violated living room shaking with rage and fear. 43 years of marriage, 21 years of widowhood, and nobody had ever made me feel this helpless in my own home. But helpless and defeated were 2 different things. I'd been underestimated my entire life, because I was a woman, because I was a teacher, because I was polite and accommodating. These men had just made the same mistake. They had no idea what a mother would do to protect her child. I drove back to the Harrison farm through back roads, checking my mirrors constantly, and taking a deliberately confusing route to make sure I wasn't followed. Michael was waiting for me in the old farmhouse, pacing like a caged animal. "They found you," I said without preamble. "They have photos of you here." His face went white. "How is that possible? I've been so careful." "Doesn't matter now. They gave me an ultimatum. Sign over the Montana land by tomorrow night, or they kill us both." I sat down on a dusty crate, suddenly feeling every one of my 68 years. "Michael, How did you end up owing $3 million to these people? He ran his hands through his hair, looking younger and more vulnerable than he had since he was a teenager. Caught sneaking out of the house. It started small, Mom. Jessica said she'd found some investment opportunities that could make us rich quickly. Private loans with huge returns. Let me guess. You needed seed money to get started. Exactly. First, it was $12,000, then $30,000. The returns were incredible at first, enough to pay back the loans and have money left over. His voice was bitter with self-incrimination. I should have known it was too good to be true. What happened? The whole thing was a Ponzi scheme. When it collapsed, everyone who'd borrowed money to invest was left holding the debt. But our loans weren't from banks, Mom. They were from the kind of people who break legs when you can't pay. I thought about the 3 men who'd invaded my home, their casual confidence that violence was always an option. And Jessica knew this when she suggested the investments. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Either she's the dumbest person alive, or she's been setting me up from the beginning. He looked at me with desperate eyes. What are we going to do? For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a spark of the determination that had carried me through single motherhood, widowhood, and 41 years of dealing with difficult teenagers. We're going to give them exactly what they want, I said. The Montana property. Michael's shoulders sagged with relief and defeat. Mom, I can't let you sacrifice everything for my mistakes. Who said anything about sacrifice? I smiled, feeling more like myself than I had in days. Sweetheart, you're assuming that land is the only card we have to play. But you're forgetting something important. What's that? I've been a high school English teacher for 41 years. I've dealt with bullies, liars, and manipulators who thought they were smarter than everyone else. I stood up, brushing dust off my clothes. These people think they're dealing with a frightened old woman who will do anything to save her son. They have no idea they just picked a fight with someone who spent 4 decades outsmarting teenagers. Michael looked confused but hopeful. What's your plan? First, we're going to make sure you're somewhere truly safe. Then I'm going to give Jessica and her friends a lesson they'll never forget. I checked my watch. But we need to move fast. I have papers to sign tomorrow night, and I want to make sure those papers say exactly what I want them to say. Mom, these aren't high school kids trying to cheat on a test. These people are dangerous. I thought about the man sitting in my husband's chair making threats in my own living room. The fury I'd been holding back all day crystallized into something cold and sharp. So am I, sweetheart. They just don't know it yet. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 21 years. I called in sick to my volunteer work at the library and drove to the city to meet with the one person who could help me turn this disaster into justice served. David Reynolds had been my lawyer since my husband died. But more importantly, he'd been my student 30 years ago when he was a rebellious teenager trying to coast through senior English. Now he ran one of the most respected criminal defense firms in the state, and he still owed me a favor for not flunking him when he deserved it. Evelyn Carter, he said, standing up from his mahogany desk with a genuine smile. You look exactly the same as when you were terrorizing us with Shakespeare. I prefer educating with enthusiasm, I replied, accepting his hug. David, I need your help with something unusual. I laid out the entire story, watching his expression shift from amusement to concern to fascination as I described Jessica's scheme, the fake funeral, and the threats from Michael's creditors. Let me make sure I understand, David said, leaning back in his leather chair. Your daughter-in-law forged documents to steal your mineral rights. Your son faked his death to avoid loan sharks and now said loan sharks are threatening to kill you both unless you sign over property worth millions. That's the basic situation. Yes, Evelyn. You realize you're describing multiple felonies here. Fraud, extortion, conspiracy, possibly kidnapping if they're holding you under duress. He pulled out a legal pad. The smart thing would be to call the FBI right now and have my son arrested for fraud. Have him spend years in prison while these criminals disappear into the wind. I shook my head. There has to be another way. David studied me with the same look he'd given me when I handed back his failed midterm exams senior year. What exactly are you proposing? I want to give them what they want, but on my terms. Can you draw up documents that look legitimate but contain legal landmines they won't notice until it's too late? You want to set a trap. I want to give them enough rope to hang themselves while protecting Michael and recovering what they stole from other families. I leaned forward. David, these people have done this before. How many other seniors have lost everything because someone trusted the wrong person? He was quiet for a long moment, then smiled with an expression I remembered from the day he'd finally understood the meaning behind Hamlet's revenge plot. What did you have in mind? 3 hours later, I left David's office with a briefcase full of legal documents that looked exactly like what Jessica and her criminal friends expected, but contained enough hidden clauses to ensure they'd be confessing to multiple felonies the moment they signed them. The papers transferred ownership of my Montana property to a newly created trust with Jessica as the designated trustee. What they wouldn't realize until it was too late was that the trust documents included automatic provisions requiring any trustee to report all previous fraudulent activities to federal authorities, and that accepting the position constituted a legal confession to any crimes committed in pursuit of the property. It's diabolical, David had said admiringly. If they don't sign, they don't get the property. If they do sign, they've legally confessed to everything and triggered federal jurisdiction. I learned from the best, I replied. Shakespeare knew a thing or two about people who think they're smarter than everyone else. Now I was back home waiting for Jessica's call and trying to look like a frightened old woman instead of someone who just spent the day outmaneuvering criminals with decades more experience than a retired English teacher. My phone rang at exactly 7:30 p.m. Evelyn Jessica's voice was clipped businesslike. The Grieving Widow Act was apparently over. I have the papers ready. I'll be over in an hour. Actually, dear, could we meet somewhere else? Having people in the house so soon after Michael's funeral feels overwhelming. A pause. Where did you have in mind? Sunset Diner. It's public, well lit, and they have excellent pie. I made my voice slightly shaky. I could use the comfort of familiar surroundings. Jessica agreed, probably thinking a public location would prevent me from making a scene. She had no idea I was counting on witnesses for what came next. The Sunset Diner had been serving the best coffee and apple pie in our small town for 40 years. More importantly, it was where Sheriff Alan Miller ate dinner every Tuesday night, where prosecutor Linda Hayes met her book club, and where half the town council gathered to gossip about local politics. In other words, it was exactly where you'd want to be when you needed credible witnesses to watch criminals incriminate themselves. I arrived early, claiming my usual booth in the back corner where I could see the entire restaurant. Sheriff Miller was at his regular table working through a plate of meatloaf while reading reports. Perfect. Jessica arrived precisely on time, accompanied by the man who'd been sitting in my husband's chair the night before. She introduced him as Brian, Jessica's business partner. But I could see the calculation in his eyes as he scanned the room, noting the sheriff's presence. I thought this was going to be private, Brian said, sliding into the booth across from me. It is private, I replied mildly. No one's paying attention to us. Jessica set a manila folder on the table. These are the documents we discussed. The property transfer, some insurance paperwork, and a few other items that need your signature. I opened the folder, recognizing the legitimate-looking forgeries that would have destroyed my life if I had signed them yesterday. Instead, I pushed them aside and pulled out my briefcase. Actually, I had my lawyer prepare something more comprehensive, I said, setting David's documents on the table. I want to make sure everything is done properly. Brian's expression shifted to weariness. Your lawyer, David Reynolds. He's very thorough. I smiled grandly. He made sure these documents protect everyone's interests. For the next 20 minutes, I watched them review papers that looked exactly like what they wanted, but contained legal poison pills in every paragraph. David had been brilliant using technical language that obscured the document's true purpose, while making them appear favorable to Jessica and her associates. This seems more complicated than necessary, Jessica said, flipping through pages of dense legal text. Well, dear, when you're dealing with millions of dollars, you can't be too careful. I signaled the waitress for more coffee. David insisted on including provisions to protect against any previous irregularities in the property's ownership history. Brian looked up sharply. What kind of irregularities? Oh, you know, the usual concerns. Making sure there are no outstanding liens, no fraudulent transfers, no criminal activity associated with previous ownership changes. I kept my voice light and conversational. Standard legal protection. What I wasn't telling them was that by signing these documents, they'd be legally acknowledging that they were aware of previous criminal activity and accepting responsibility for reporting it to federal authorities. David had woven the confession requirements so cleverly into the property transfer language that they'd essentially be pleading guilty to multiple felonies. I think we should have our lawyer review this first, Brian said, starting to close the folder. Of course, I agreed easily. Though I should mention David said the property tax implications changed significantly after midnight tonight. Something about quarterly reporting requirements and federal oversight of high-value mineral rights transfers. It was complete nonsense, but it sounded official enough to create urgency. Jessica and Brian exchanged glances. What exactly happens after midnight? Jessica asked. The transfer becomes subject to additional federal scrutiny, which could delay processing for months. David said it's better to handle everything under the current regulations. I shrugged apologetically. I don't pretend to understand all the legal technicalities. Brian pulled out his phone, presumably to call their lawyer, but it was after 8:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. No legitimate attorney would be available for an emergency consultation about property transfers. Fine, he said finally, but I want to review every page before anyone signs anything. For the next 40 minutes, I sat patiently while they read through documents that would destroy them, answering their questions with carefully rehearsed explanations that made the trap sound like standard legal protection. When they finally signed, I felt the same satisfaction I'd experienced watching difficult students finally grasp a complex literary concept. They had no idea they just confessed to everything. The moment Jessica and Brian finished signing the documents, I excused myself to use the restroom, taking my briefcase with me. Instead of going to the ladies' room, I walked straight to Sheriff Alan Miller's table. Alan, I said quietly, sitting down across from him. I need to report multiple felonies, and I have written confessions from the perpetrators. To his credit, Sheriff Miller set down his fork and gave me his full attention without questioning why Evelyn Carter, retired English teacher and pillar of the community, was suddenly talking about criminal confessions. I quickly explained the situation while keeping one eye on Jessica and Brian, who were still sitting in the booth, probably planning how to spend their millions. Sheriff Miller's expression grew darker with each detail. Evelyn, these people threatened to kill you and your son. They made their intentions very clear. I opened my briefcase and showed him the documents. My lawyer designed these papers so that by signing them, they'd legally acknowledge their criminal activities and agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. Sheriff Miller examined the papers, his 20 years of police experience evident in how quickly he grasped the legal implications. This is incredibly clever and completely legal. Completely. David made sure of that. I glanced toward the booth where Jessica was checking her watch impatiently. Alan, there's something else. My son isn't actually dead. That got his attention. Come again. Michael faked his death to protect himself from these people. He's been hiding, but they found him anyway. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos I'd taken of the forged documents in Jessica's kitchen. I have evidence of the fraud, extortion, and conspiracy, and now I have their signed confessions. Sheriff Miller was quiet for a moment, then smiled with genuine admiration. Evelyn, in 30 years of police work, I've never seen a civilian conduct a more thorough criminal investigation. He stood up, straightening his uniform. Let me go have a conversation with your dinner companions. Wait. I put a hand on his arm. There's something else you should know. They have partners, other people involved in this scheme. If you arrest Jessica and Brian now, the others might disappear. What are you suggesting? Give me 5 more minutes with them. Let me confirm the meeting location where they're supposed to deliver the signed documents to their bosses. I smiled. Then you can arrest everyone at once. Sheriff Miller studied my face, probably wondering when the mild-mannered English teacher had turned into a master strategist. 5 minutes. But Evelyn, if this goes sideways, it won't. I've been handling difficult people for 41 years. These criminals are just better dressed than my former students. I walked back to the booth where Jessica and Brian were growing increasingly impatient. Sorry for the delay, I said, sliding back into my seat. Where do we go from here? Brian relaxed slightly. We need to get these documents to our legal team tonight for final processing. There's a warehouse on Commerce Way where we're meeting them. Tonight, the sooner we complete the transfer, the sooner we can all move forward, Jessica said. It's been such a difficult time. I nodded sympathetically while mentally noting the location. Commerce Way was perfect for a police raid, isolated enough that civilians wouldn't be at risk when the arrests went down. I suppose you'll need me there to verify my identity for the transfer. Actually, no, Brian said quickly. Your signature on these documents is all we need. You can go home and try to get some rest. Of course, they didn't want me at the meeting. I was supposed to go home and wait quietly while they celebrated stealing millions from a grieving mother. Well then, I said, standing up and gathering my things. I guess this is goodbye? Jessica actually had the audacity to hug me. Thank you, Evelyn. Michael would be so proud of how strong you've been. As I walked out of the diner, I saw Sheriff Miller finishing his dinner and preparing to follow me. In 30 minutes, Jessica and her criminal associates would discover that their victim had been hunting them all along. But first, I had a phone call to make. I called Michael from my car in the diner parking lot, watching through the window as Sheriff Miller made his own phone calls, presumably coordinating with state and federal authorities. Mom! Michael's voice was tight with anxiety. How did it go? Better than expected. They signed everything, and Sheriff Miller is coordinating arrests as we speak. I started my car, keeping my voice calm, despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Sweetheart, I need you to stay exactly where you are until this is over. What about Jessica? Does she suspect anything? I thought about my daughter-in-law's performance, the fake grief, the casual threats, the way she'd manipulated both Michael and me for months. She suspects I'm a frightened old woman who just signed away millions to save her son's life. She has no idea what actually happened. Mom, what if something goes wrong? What if they figure out the documents are traps before the police get there? It was a legitimate concern. David's legal landmines were sophisticated, but they weren't foolproof. If Jessica and Brian had a lawyer review the documents before meeting with their partners, they might realize they'd been outmaneuvered. Then we'll deal with that problem when it happens, I said firmly. Michael, I need you to understand something. What happened to you? What these people tried to do to our family, it's not your fault. Jessica targeted you specifically because you're decent and trusting. I should have been smarter. I should have seen through her. Sweetheart, I lived with your father for 24 years and thought I knew him completely. Sometimes, the people closest to us are the hardest to see clearly. I pulled out of the diner parking lot following the route that would take me past Commerce Way. The important thing is that we're fixing it. 22 minutes later, I parked on a hill overlooking the warehouse district, close enough to see the activity but far enough away to be safe. Sheriff Miller had been thorough. I could see unmarked police cars positioned at every exit and what looked like federal agents in tactical gear surrounding the main building. My phone buzzed with a text from David. FBI confirms your documents triggered automatic federal jurisdiction. Whatever happens tonight, these people are going away for a very long time. At 10:52 p.m., I watched through binoculars as 3 cars converged on the warehouse Jessica and Brian had mentioned. The first car contained Jessica and Brian. The second held 2 men I recognized from my living room the night before. The third car held 2 people I didn't recognize, probably higher-level criminals who'd been running this operation from behind the scenes. They were inside the warehouse for exactly 12 minutes before the building was surrounded by law enforcement officers with floodlights and megaphones. This is the FBI. The building is surrounded. Exit through the front door with your hands visible. What followed was anticlimactic in the best possible way. No gunfights, no dramatic chase scenes, just 6 criminals walking out of a warehouse with their hands in the air, realizing too late that they'd been outmaneuvered by a retired English teacher who'd been underestimated her entire life. My phone rang as the last suspect was loaded into a police car. Evelyn Carter, it's Sheriff Miller. It's over. We got all of them plus evidence of at least 12 other property fraud cases in 6 states. Your son can come home. I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding. What happens now? Now you and Michael give statements. We process the evidence, and these people face federal charges for fraud, extortion, conspiracy, and criminal enterprise. His voice was warm with approval. Evelyn, what you did tonight probably saved dozens of other families from becoming victims. As I drove home, I realized I felt different than I had this morning. Not just relieved, but powerful in a way I'd never experienced before. For 41 years, I'd shaped young minds and helped students find their strength. Tonight, I discovered my own. But there was still one more conversation I needed to have. Michael was waiting on my front porch when I pulled into the driveway, and seeing him there in the light from my porch lamp, alive and safe and free, nearly brought me to my knees with relief. Is it really over? He asked, pulling me into a fierce hug. It's over. I confirmed. Jessica and her associates are in federal custody. The property is safe. You're safe. We went inside, and I made coffee while Michael sat at my kitchen table looking older and wiser than he had just a week ago. The boy who'd trusted too easily was gone, replaced by a man who'd learned hard lessons about human nature. Mom, I need to know something, he said as I set his favorite mug in front of him. When did you figure out that Jessica was targeting me specifically? I'd been thinking about that question myself. Honestly, not until I saw how quickly she moved after your supposed death. The grief was too perfect, too performed. But the real confirmation was when she brought those papers to my house. She knew exactly what she wanted and exactly how to manipulate me to get it. How long do you think she was planning this? Probably from the moment she met you. The truth was painful but necessary. Michael. Jessica researched our family before your first date. She knew about my father's property. She knew I'd helped you buy your house. She knew I'd do anything to protect you. He was quiet for a long time, processing the betrayal. So our entire marriage was fake. Her feelings were fake. Yours were real. That matters. Does it? I feel like such a fool. I reached across the table and took his hand. Sweetheart, you fell in love with the person she pretended to be. That person was kind, supportive, and made you happy. The fact that it was an act doesn't diminish the genuine emotions you felt. What am I supposed to do now? How do I trust anyone again? It was the question every parent dreads. The moment when you realize your child's innocence is truly gone. But it was also an opportunity to help him find strength he didn't know he had. You learn to trust yourself first, I said. You learn to recognize red flags, to ask questions to verify things that seem too good to be true. But you don't let fear keep you from connecting with people who deserve your trust. Michael smiled for the first time since this nightmare began, like my mom who turned out to be a criminal mastermind when I needed her to be. I prefer strategically gifted, I replied, echoing my conversation with David. And I learned from watching you actually the way you protected me by disappearing. The courage it took to fake your death when you realized how dangerous these people were. You're braver than you think. What happens now? I looked around my kitchen, my house, my life that had been threatened and was now secure. Now you move back home. We figure out what to do with mineral rights worth millions, and I go back to volunteering at the library. Except maybe I'll also help the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit identify seniors who might be vulnerable to these kinds of schemes. You want to keep fighting criminals. I want to keep protecting people who can't protect themselves. Turns out, I'm good at it. 3 weeks later, I received a letter from the federal prosecutor handling Jessica's case. She and her associates had been charged with 23 felonies across 6 states with evidence linking them to property fraud schemes targeting elderly victims nationwide. The FBI had recovered over $45 million in stolen assets. My testimony, combined with the ingenious confession documents David had designed, formed the backbone of a case that would likely send these people to prison for decades. But the real victory was simpler than justice or money. It was Michael healthy and whole, learning to trust again while building a life based on genuine relationships instead of manipulation. It was me discovering at 68 that I was far stronger and more capable than anyone had ever imagined. And it was the knowledge that sometimes when people underestimate you, that underestimation becomes the very weapon you need to protect everything you love. The funeral had been fake, but my son's resurrection was beautifully, powerfully real. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.